This is Dawn Must Follow Night by Hunter Nansen. Part 1, Chapter 26. Read by the author. The storm gathered in the west and darkened the horizon until it seemed night had come early. Yarick stood on the battlements with his squad and watched a great gray cloud charge the castle, a wall of rain at its front. "Those Dindrans better not try anything," Hob said from beside him, flexing a heavy warbow. Yarick guessed his squad mate was proud of being one of the few students who could pull it back. "I'll drop them before they can get close." "How much have you actually practiced with that thing, Hob?" Peter asked. "Enough. Dimitri showed me how to use it, and we coded the arrowheads." Yarick rolled his eyes. He looked at the weapon he held and cursed the rain. The blades did not keep their armory filled with many weapons useful in a siege, and Albert had used most of the fire powder in the bomb, so the instructors had been forced to scour the castle for weapons that might be useful against knights in full plate. Yarick was lucky enough to be given a fire lance, which sounded a lot more interesting than it was. A chamber of fire powder fixed to the end of a long pole. It would not be enough to kill a knight, but it could keep them away from the inner gate. He hoped it would still work in the rain, then wished he wouldn't have to find out. The swath of rain pelted the walls of the castle. Yarick winced when it reached him and frowned at the end of his fire lance. He fingered the matches in his pocket. "I think I see something," Hob yelled. Yarick looked where he was pointing. At first he thought Hob was just overexcited, but 3 knights emerged from the shadows beyond the gate and approached, rain pinging off their armor. The one at the lead took his helmet off. "We wish to speak with the prelate." "Here," the prelate said from beside Yarick. "Release the captain when the gate is completed. His Grace the Lord of Dindra will brook no violence against his ambassadors." "It was not I who initiated the conflict. Sir Dwarf has been treated well and is in no distress." "Let us see him." Yarick looked at the prelate's face and tried to guess what he was thinking. Marith finally signaled to Dimitri after a long silence. The instructor descended the steps of the battlements and walked to the dungeon. The knights seemed to be unarmed, but Yarick was far beyond letting his guard down. He tightened his grip around the lance and felt a hand on his shoulder. The prelate was looking down at him. Rain had darkened his black hair almost to the degree of his eyes, but his expression was sad. His hand was a small comfort against the storm. The instructor and the captain announced themselves with squishy, wet steps as they trudged across the small yard and climbed the stairs to the battlements. Dimitri brought Dorif, who, aside from looking pale and frightened, was unharmed. "I'm well, men. I order you to complete work on the gate." The soldier squinted and frowned. "Those of you who threw down their arms will be spared. You will surrender the castle, prelate, one way or another." Dorif squirmed. "What are you doing? Stop this! I order you!" The soldier ignored him and addressed Marith. "Do you surrender?" The prelate held Dorif with his left hand and drew his sword with his right. The soldier sighed. "Very well. As for you," he said to Dorif, "Article 53. Then he stomped off. "No, soldier, that doesn't apply. You can't do this," Dorif shouted after him, adding a few epithets that made Yarick raise his eyebrows. Marith grabbed the hysterical captain and forced him to look into his eyes. "What is Article 53? What does it mean?" Dorif panted and calmed himself. "Article 53. Article 53. Any captain deemed unfit to lead by a majority may be summarily removed from command." He paused and looked around at the drenched students and instructors for sympathy. "I have been stripped of my—" A crossbow bolt grew from his throat. He staggered back a few steps as blood ran down the tree of Dindra on his breastplate. Command. His eyes faded and momentum carried him off the edge of the battlements. The captain's body landed with a squishy crunch. Get down! Everybody down! Marith and the instructors yelled. Yorick ducked behind the battlements. Hob, get down! Hob stared down in shock at Sordurev's lifeless body. He looked at Yorick and started to duck, but too late. 2 bolts from a volley struck the large student in the chest and pierced his gambeson. The warbow slipped from his grasp and clattered on the stones of the battlement. No! Yorick yelled. He kept his head down and shuffled over to his squad mate. Why don't you listen? Why don't you ever listen? Hob clutched at the bolts and stared at his bloody hands. His vacant stare fixated on Yorick. Mama, I'm sorry, Mama, he said, and died. Yorick cursed and looked around for help. He found Peter looking at him with the same bewilderment. Marith was gone. They stumbled when something smashed into the gate. Battering ram, Dmitri boomed. Throw lances! Yorick and Peter stared at each other. It was their cue. Yorick wiped the rain from his face and gripped the lance tighter. Should he just stay down? The captain had said they would take prisoners alive. He looked down at Hob, whose empty eyes were staring up into the rain. Yorick reached out and closed them, then folded the boy's arms. "Don greet thee," he said, and looked at Peter. "Ready, friend." Peter nodded. Yorick's heart pounded against his rib cage. He fumbled with the match and struggled to light the fuse, bending over the end of the lance to shelter it. Once, twice, 3 times he lit a match, only to have the damp fuse fizzle out. He took a deep breath, struck his last match, and the fuse burst into life. He stared at it for a moment, then realized if he kept staring he would lose his newly regrown eyebrows. He jumped up and aimed at the group of soldiers winding up to ram the gate. He flinched as a bolt bounced off the wall in front of his waist. His heart did its best to force its way out of his chest while he watched the fuse. "Wait until the flames are burning," Dmitri had said. "If you throw it too soon, it could go out. Then you're just throwing a piece of wood." The fuse reached its end. Yorick waited for nothing. He was about to let out every curse he knew to berate the rain when whoosh! The end burst into flame and sizzled against the deluge. "Done!" he screamed, hurling the burning lance at the ram. 3 other students did the same, far less than the amount of lances that had been given out. The flaming spears struck just as the knights were surging forward to crash the gate. 2 lances angled under the roof of the battering ram. Flame collided with plate, and the knights staggered back, bewildered. The ram halted. Yorick's lance stuck in the roof and burned a hole. The 4th lance stuck in the mud and fizzled out. Yorick was about to duck behind the stone when he noticed another man among the knights. The figure took advantage of the surprise that the fired lances had caused and pounced on a knight from behind. He plunged a small dagger into the weak spot where helmet met breastplate. The Dindran's mouth opened and closed and blood poured out of his neck. He fell face first in the mud, dead. Yorick barely recognized the assassin as the prelate before he disappeared. Another man fell screaming, clutching at the back of his knees. Marith stood over him and watched him squirm before lifting the man's head and slitting his throat. Lightning flashed and illuminated the mingling blood and rain flowing down the prelate's blade. The following thunder carried shouts and whinnies from beyond the darkness of the gate. Cavalry emerged, leveling their lances and charging. Marith watched them without moving. The horses snorted and fought their riders, who whipped them on towards the black-eyed menace. The prelate waited until he was almost skewered. Then he vanished. The knights pulled up short, horses stamping in the mud and exhaling mist. "That is enough for now." Yarek jumped at the prelate's voice from beside him. "Let us see if they do the wise thing." The Dindrans glared at the battlements. Then the commander barked a few orders and they gathered the bodies, bearing the survivors back to safety. "Good," Aerith said, wiping his saber before sheathing it. "Let us hope that no more blood is spilled this moon."